Don't touch anything else. My husband took the glass right out of my hand. I actually laughed. Not because Daniel was being funny. Daniel has many fine qualities, but spontaneous comedy has never been one of them. I laughed because 5 seconds earlier, I'd been standing on Rick's patio drinking sangria and listening to Daniel's cousin Marty explain why Maryland property taxes were apparently a personal attack on him. Nothing about the afternoon had suggested I was about to receive instructions from a federal agent. What Daniel held the glass away from me. His face made me stop smiling. You didn't see who handed you that? Of course I did. Scott. I turned toward the drink table. Scott wasn't there. That was strange because he'd been standing beside me maybe 30 seconds earlier. Melissa had brought him over when we arrived and then disappeared into the house to help Evelyn with something. I'd met Scott twice before. He was 48, neatly dressed, good teeth, easy smile. The kind of man who remembered your name and made you feel slightly guilty for forgetting his. He'd approached carrying 2 glasses. Claire, right. That depends. Are you selling something? He'd laughed. I figured you might need rescuing. He nodded toward Marty, who was explaining assessments now. You may have saved my life. Scott handed me the sangria. Then came the questions. How was work? Was I still with the school district? Was Emily living in Washington now? Did Daniel still travel a lot? Did I usually beat him home in the evenings? Nothing had sounded odd at the time. People ask questions at family gatherings because the alternative is discussing the weather or somebody's knee replacement. Now Daniel was holding my glass with a napkin wrapped around it. Where did he go? He asked. I don't know. Claire, get Emily. Daniel, get your purse too. We're leaving. I stared at him. Your mother spent 3 weeks planning this reunion. I know. And we've been here 40 minutes. I know. Then tell me what's happening. His eyes moved past me toward the yard. 30 relatives were scattered around picnic tables and folding chairs. Kids were playing cornhole near the fence. Rick was at the grill arguing with somebody about whether hamburgers could be medium rare without becoming a public health event. Everything looked normal. Daniel leaned closer. Claire, please. Just this once. That got me moving. You have to understand something about my husband. Daniel had been with the FBI for more than 20 years. He was careful about work, and I respected that. I never asked him questions I knew he couldn't answer. But sometimes that professional habit followed him through our front door. A phone call would come during dinner. What happened? Work. He'd cancel a weekend. Why can't get into it? After 19 years of marriage, can't get into it had become the third person in our relationship. Still, Daniel rarely said please when that look came over his face. I found Emily near the kitchen. She was 22 and had recently reached the age where she considered family reunions something to endure in exchange for free food. Grab your bag, I told her. Why, your father? She nodded. That was apparently sufficient explanation. On our way out, I glanced toward the side of the house. Scott was there. So was Rick. They were standing close enough that they clearly weren't discussing baseball. Rick said something I couldn't hear. Scott answered. Then Rick looked toward the patio and saw me watching. He immediately stepped back. Scott turned too. For 1 second our eyes met. Then Daniel touched my elbow. Car. We left without saying goodbye to Evelyn, which I knew we'd pay for later. Daniel drove. I sat beside him. Emily was in the back. We made it maybe 2 miles before I said, start talking. What exactly did Scott ask you? That's your explanation, Claire. I repeated the conversation. Work, Emily, Daniel's travel, when I got home. Daniel's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. I noticed. So those weren't innocent questions. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. From the back seat, Emily said he asked me about Grandma. Daniel looked at her in the mirror. What did he ask? Whether she still lived alone. The car got very quiet. I turned around. When before lunch, I thought he was making conversation. So did I said. Daniel didn't say anything. That bothered me more than if he had. When we got home, Emily went upstairs and I followed Daniel into the kitchen. All right, no more questions about what Scott asked. Tell me why you took that glass. Daniel set his keys on the counter. I've seen him before. Where? He hesitated. That was enough. Work, yes. What does that mean? It means I recognize him from something connected to work. Is he dangerous? I don't know. I stared at him. That is becoming your favorite answer. Because right now it's the truthful one. You just pulled a drink out of my hand in front of 30 people. I know. You rushed our daughter out of a family reunion. I know. And now I'm supposed to be satisfied with, I don't know. No, that answer surprised me. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face. I'm trying to figure out what I can tell you without saying something I shouldn't. Then figure it out quickly because you don't get to scare me and classify my own life. His expression changed a little. Fair. The doorbell rang. Daniel and I looked at each other. He went to the door. Melissa walked in before he had it fully open. What the hell is wrong with you? Daniel closed the door behind her. Melissa. No. You text me, tell me not to leave with Scott, and then refuse to explain why I told you I'd call. You also disappeared from Mom's reunion with Claire and Emily like somebody yelled fire. She looked at me. Are you okay? I think so. You think so? Welcome to my afternoon. Melissa turned back to her brother. I knew you didn't like him. This isn't about whether I like him. You've met him twice. Daniel's voice stayed calm. What name did he give you when you met? She frowned. What his full name? Scott Mercer. Daniel didn't respond. Melissa folded her arms. Why are you asking me that? He looked at me once then back at his sister. That's not the name I know him by. Melissa's arms slowly dropped to her sides, and for the first time since she'd stormed through our front door, she had nothing to say. Melissa stared at Daniel. What do you mean that's not the name you know him by? Daniel pulled out one of the kitchen chairs. Sit down. Oh, absolutely not. You don't get to say something like that and then tell me to sit down. Melissa, Daniel. I almost admired her commitment to making his name sound like an accusation. I went to the refrigerator and took out 3 bottles of water. After what had happened at the reunion, nobody seemed interested in anything poured into a glass. Daniel waited until Melissa finally sat. I've seen Scott's photograph before, he said. Where, in connection with an investigation. Her face tightened. What kind of investigation? I can't discuss that. She gave a short, humorless laugh. Of course you can't. I'm not trying to be difficult, you never are. That's what makes it so impressive. Daniel ignored that. The name attached to the photograph wasn't Scott Mercer. What was it? I'm not going to give you another name until I know exactly what we're dealing with. Melissa looked at me as if I might translate him into ordinary English. I couldn't. So what, she said. You saw a picture of somebody who looks like Scott, yes. And from that you decided he's a criminal. No. You grabbed a drink out of Claire's hand. Because I didn't know why he was approaching my wife. Maybe because she was standing next to the drinks. I said, in fairness, I do have that effect on people. Neither of them laughed. Tough room. Daniel leaned forward. The investigation involved people using personal relationships to get access to financial information. Older victims, people with assets. Melissa's expression changed, but only slightly. Daniel continued. I'm not saying Scott committed a crime. I'm saying I recognized him in a context where I had no reason to expect him at my brother's house. Melissa looked toward the window. You've never liked him. That's not true. You asked me what he did for a living the first time I mentioned him. That's a fairly normal question. You asked where he went to college. You told me he went to Georgetown. So he said Syracuse at Christmas. I looked at Daniel. You remembered that. He shrugged. Melissa rolled her eyes. This is exactly what I mean. What? You're always doing this. Everybody's a discrepancy to you. Daniel sat back. For a second I could see the younger brother and sister underneath the adults sitting in my kitchen. Melissa had been divorced for 6 years. Her marriage had ended badly, but not dramatically. No secret second family, no private island. Her husband simply decided at 41 that he was happier somewhere else, and apparently that somewhere else included a 34-year-old dental hygienist named Kendra. Melissa had spent years afterward hearing variations of "you'll meet somebody from relatives who meant well," and should have stopped. Then she met Scott. He remembered birthdays. He cooked. He called Evelyn just to check on her. More importantly, he treated Melissa like her decisions didn't require family approval. She looked at her brother now. "Do you have actual evidence that Scott has done something?" Daniel was quiet. "Do you? Not enough for me to tell you that? Then maybe you should stop treating him like he's already guilty." The irritating part was that she wasn't entirely wrong. I trusted Daniel's instincts. I'd seen enough over 19 years to know that when something bothered him professionally, there was usually a reason. But I also knew what it was like to live with someone who always had 3 more pieces of information than everybody else. Sometimes being right didn't make him easier to live with. Daniel's phone rang. He looked at the screen. "Rick." He answered and put it on speaker. "Yeah, what the hell happened?" Rick asked. "No, hello. No, is Claire okay? Just that." Daniel said, "I'm sorting it out. How serious is this? I don't know yet." There were those words again. Rick exhaled. "You're not turning Mom's reunion into some federal circus, are you?" Daniel's eyebrows went up. I left quietly. Well, people noticed. I'm sure they survived. "Look, I don't know what you think you saw, but Scott's been good to Melissa." Melissa pointed at the phone as if Rick had just won her case. "Thank you," Rick continued. "The guy's decent. Don't make him into John Dillinger because he handed Claire a sangria." I glanced at Daniel. Something in his expression had sharpened. Not dramatically. If you didn't know him, you'd miss it. I knew him. "How do you know what he handed Claire?" Daniel asked. Silence. Then Rick said, "Melissa told me." Melissa shook her head. I looked at her. She mouthed, "I didn't." Rick cleared his throat. Or somebody did. "I don't know. Everybody's talking." Daniel let it go. "All right, I'll call you later. Just don't blow up the family over nothing." The call ended. Melissa immediately said, "See," Daniel looked at the dark phone screen. "See what even Rick thinks you're overreacting." Before Daniel could answer, Melissa's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then stopped. I knew immediately who it was. "Scott?" She didn't answer. Daniel held out his hand. "Let me see. No, Melissa." "It's my phone. What did he say?" She read the message again. Her mouth tightened. Finally, she put the phone on the table and turned it around. The message read, "Your brother thinks I'm somebody else. Ask him about your mother's lake property." Nobody spoke for a moment. I read it twice. "What does your mother's property have to do with Scott?" Melissa picked up her phone. "Nothing." Daniel said, "That wasn't an answer." I told Scott Mom sold the place. So what Evelyn had inherited a small waterfront property from an aunt years earlier. She rented it out for a while, got tired of dealing with repairs and tenants, and finally sold it the previous fall. It wasn't a secret, but it wasn't exactly cocktail party material either. "How much did you tell him?" Daniel asked. "Nothing important. Did you tell him what she got for it?" "Know where she put the money?" "No." "Did he ever talk to Mom about it?" Melissa looked away. There it was. I said, "Melissa." He gave her a name. Daniel went still. "What name?" "A financial advisor." "When?" "I don't know." January, February. Scott introduced Mom to somebody handling her money. He didn't handle anything. He recommended somebody. "How do you know?" "Because that's what Mom told me." Daniel stood and walked away from the table. Melissa immediately became defensive again. "Stop doing that." "Doing what?" "Acting like I handed Mom's social security number to a guy in a parking lot." "I didn't say you did. You don't have to." I watched the two of them and suddenly understood something unpleasant. Daniel kept things from people because he thought information was dangerous. Melissa kept things from Daniel because she thought judgment was inevitable. Evelyn apparently kept things from both of them because she didn't want her children managing her life. And somewhere in the middle of all that silence was a man named Scott Mercer. Or maybe not Scott Mercer, who seemed to know exactly which doors were open. Daniel picked up his phone. "Who are you calling?" I asked. "Mom." He put it on speaker. Evelyn answered on the 4th ring. "If this is about you leaving without saying goodbye, I'm still deciding how offended I am." Mom, I need to ask you something. That sentence has never improved my day. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Did you invest any of the money from the lake property through someone Scott recommended? There was no answer. Mom, I heard you. Did you? Another pause. Then Evelyn said very clearly, Daniel, I am 74 years old. I don't need your permission to invest my own money. I looked at my husband. He looked at me. Neither of us needed her to say yes. She already had. By 9 the next morning, we were sitting around Evelyn's kitchen table like the world's least cheerful breakfast club. Evelyn had made coffee. Nobody was drinking much of it. Daniel sat across from his mother with the yellow legal pad in front of him. Melissa was beside me, arms folded. Rick had shown up 10 minutes late carrying a cardboard tray from Duncan, apparently under the impression that 6 donuts could restore order to the Bennett family. They could not. Daniel started. Mom, when did you first meet the advisor Scott recommended? Evelyn stared at him. Are you taking notes? I want to keep the timeline straight. You're taking notes. Mom. Daniel stopped talking to me like I'm somebody you interviewed downtown. I'm trying to help. Then be my son for 5 minutes. Daniel put the pen down. That was when I stepped in. Evelyn, forget Daniel's questions. He looked at me. I ignored him. Just tell us what happened. Start wherever it makes sense to you. Evelyn gave her son a pointed look. See, Claire knows how conversation works. Daniel leaned back. I had been married long enough to know when to enjoy a victory quietly. Evelyn told us that Scott had mentioned a financial advisor named Kevin Wallace sometime in January. She had complained about the interest she was earning on the proceeds from the lake property, and Scott said he knew someone who worked with retirees and conservative investments. I am not a retiree, Evelyn said. Rick blinked. Mom, you retired 11 years ago. That's an employment status, Richard, not a personality. Despite everything, I smiled. She had spoken with Wallace twice by phone, then met him at an office in Columbia. The office existed. There was a receptionist, business cards, framed licenses on the wall. Nothing about it had looked suspicious to her. How much? Daniel asked. Evelyn looked at him. How much what? How much did you invest? She hesitated. That was the first time all morning she looked less than completely sure of herself. 180,000. Melissa sat up. You put $180,000 into something Scott recommended. Evelyn's eyes flashed. Please don't join your brother. I'm not joining anybody. I didn't know it was that much. It's my money, I know. Then stop saying the number like I bought a racehorse. Across the table, Rick reached for his coffee and nearly knocked it over. He caught it before it tipped. Do you have all the paperwork? He asked. The question itself was reasonable. It was how quickly he asked it that caught my attention. Evelyn nodded. Of course I have the paperwork. Statements too. Yes, Richard. Daniel glanced at Rick, but only briefly. Evelyn got up and went toward the den. While we waited, Melissa turned on Daniel. You knew about this kind of thing and never told us. I didn't know Scott was anywhere near this family. I mean the investigation. I couldn't discuss it. Of course. Daniel's jaw tightened. I could feel another round starting. Then something came back to me. Not from the night before, from the reunion. Scott had been standing beside Evelyn near the kitchen door teasing her because she'd complained about what the lake property sold for after taxes. He'd said something like, Tommy would tell you to spend some of it on yourself. At the time, I'd barely noticed. Now I did. When Evelyn came back carrying a thick accordion folder, I asked, How did Scott know you called Dad Tommy? She stopped. Daniel turned toward me. Melissa frowned. What, yesterday? Scott called your father Tommy, Rick said. So nobody calls him Tommy. Their father's name had been Thomas. Daniel and his siblings called him Dad. Grandchildren called him Grandpa. Everybody else had called him Tom. Only Evelyn called him Tommy, usually when she was telling a story about when they were young. Evelyn set the folder on the table. He may have heard me say it. When I asked, she didn't answer immediately. Melissa leaned forward. Mom. Evelyn pulled out a chair. He stopped by a few times. Melissa stared at her. Scott. Yes. Here, yes. Without me, Evelyn gave her a look. You don't supervise my visitors either. That's not what I'm asking. He was helping me organize some things. Daniel reached for the folder. Evelyn slapped her hand down on top of it. I'm giving you these because Claire asked me like an adult. Do not make me regret it. Daniel slowly withdrew his hand. Yes, ma'am. She slid the folder toward him. For the next 15 minutes, we went through statements and letters. I understood maybe 70% of it, which was still more than I expected before breakfast. The statements looked legitimate. Evelyn's account showed modest gains. Company logos, account numbers, quarterly summaries. Then Daniel stopped at one document. What is this? Evelyn leaned over. Something about letting Melissa help if I ever needed it. Melissa looked confused. Help with what finances? You never asked me. I hadn't decided. Daniel placed the pages flat on the table. At the top it said, Durable Financial Power of Attorney. I knew what that meant in broad terms. Evelyn would be giving someone authority to handle financial matters for her under specified circumstances. Melissa's name appeared as the proposed agent. That's weird, she said. Daniel turned another page. There was a signature near the bottom. Melissa leaned closer. Her expression changed. That's supposed to be mine. Is it? Daniel asked. No, Rick said. Maybe it's just a draft. Melissa picked up the page. A draft with my signature. Evelyn looked genuinely shaken now. Not confused, angry. I never gave anybody permission to sign Melissa's name. Daniel's voice became very calm. Mom, did you sign this? No. Did you authorize anyone to prepare it? I discussed the possibility. That's all. Rick leaned over. Maybe somebody at the office copied the wrong form. Daniel turned his head. What office? Rick paused. The advisor's office. How do you know where this came from? Rick's eyes moved toward the paperwork. I don't. I'm saying maybe that's where it came from. You said the office like you knew. Oh, for God's sake, Daniel. Scott showed me their website once, that's all. The room went quiet. Daniel didn't push. That interested me almost as much as Rick's answer. A year earlier, I probably wouldn't have noticed any of it. But now I was noticing everything. Not because I had suddenly become an investigator. I hadn't. I was simply paying attention to what people said when they were uncomfortable. And everybody at that table was uncomfortable for a different reason. Daniel eventually explained that someone else would need to handle the investigative side now that his own family was directly involved. Evelyn frowned. So, you're staying out of it as much as I'm required to. I couldn't resist. So for once, somebody else gets to tell you to stay out of something? Daniel looked at me. Melissa snorted. Even Evelyn smiled. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, but we needed those 3 seconds. Then Melissa stood. I need some air. She picked up her purse. Where are you going? Daniel asked. See, this is why nobody tells you anything. She walked out. I almost followed her, but Evelyn started asking questions about whether her accounts were safe. Daniel finally had something useful to do, so we stayed. By late afternoon, we were home. I was putting laundry into the washer when my phone buzzed. Melissa, I'm meeting Scott. Don't tell Daniel. I need to hear him explain it himself. I read it twice. There are moments in a family when loyalty means keeping somebody's confidence. And there are moments when keeping their confidence would be idiotic. I gave myself about 3 seconds to decide which one this was. Then I walked into the living room. Daniel was on the couch, reading something on his laptop. I stopped in front of him. You're going to hate your sister. He looked up. What did she do? I handed him my phone. Daniel read Melissa's text once. Then again. For a man trained to stay calm, he had a remarkably expressive way of closing a laptop. Where is she meeting him? She didn't say. He called her. Straight to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. Don't start pacing, I said. I'm not pacing. You're standing up with nowhere to go. That's pacing with better posture. He ignored me and sent her a text. 30 seconds later, my phone rang. Melissa, I answered. Before you yell at me, I'm not going to yell. You told Daniel. Yes, I specifically asked you not to. And I specifically ignored you. Claire, you can be mad at me tomorrow. Tonight I'd rather have you alive enough to do it. There was a pause. Then she sighed. I'm meeting him at Harbor House. I knew the place. Busy waterfront restaurant, plenty of people around. That made me feel slightly better. Daniel held out his hand for my phone. I shook my head. Are you already there? I asked. Parking. Stay in public. Don't go anywhere else with him. I'm not an idiot. I didn't say you were. Behind me, Daniel mouthed, Put me on. I turned away from him. Your brother needs to know where you are. He knows now. That isn't what I said. Another pause. Fine, tell him, but I'm talking to Scott. She hung up. Daniel was already making a call, not to Melissa, to the agents who were handling the matter now. And then, because apparently neither of us had enough sense to stay home, we drove to Annapolis. We didn't go inside the restaurant. Daniel had been very clear that the last thing anyone needed was him walking up to Scott and turning Melissa's conversation into a confrontation. So we sat in a parking lot nearby like the least romantic stakeout in Maryland. I looked at the dashboard clock. How long? 11 minutes? It feels like 40. It's been 11. This is why nobody enjoys waiting with you. He glanced at me. Claire. I know. I stopped talking. Later, Melissa told me exactly what happened inside. Scott was already seated when she arrived. He stood when he saw her. That detail bothered her afterward. Not because it was suspicious, because it was familiar. Scott always stood when she approached a table. He pulled out chairs. Remembered how she took her coffee. Called when he said he would. Manipulative people would be much easier to recognize if they were unpleasant all the time. What's going on? He asked. You tell me. He looked tired rather than nervous. That was clever too. Your brother thinks I'm somebody I'm not. He says he's seen you before. I'm sure he thinks he has. What about the paperwork? Scott shook his head. Melissa, I don't prepare legal documents. My signature is on one. Then somebody made a mistake. A draft gets populated from the wrong file. Somebody scans the wrong page. Offices screw things up. It was plausible enough to make her hesitate. Scott saw that. Then he went after the part of Melissa that had been bruised for years. Your brother has spent your whole life deciding who you should trust. She told me later that was the moment she almost got up and left, not because he was wrong, but because he was too right. Scott continued, You finally make one decision without asking Daniel's permission, and what happens? He turns it into an investigation. This isn't about Daniel, isn't it? No. Then why are we talking about what your brother thinks instead of what you know about me? Melissa didn't have a good answer. That was Scott's talent. He could take a legitimate question and make you feel guilty for asking it. She asked why he had been visiting Evelyn without telling her. Your mother asked for help. She's my mother. She's also an adult. Again, partly true. She didn't want Daniel involved in every financial decision she made, Scott said. Can you really blame her? Melissa couldn't. That was the problem. Then she asked about the investment. Scott leaned back. Your mother made a conservative investment through a legitimate business. She wasn't risking her whole future over $180,000. Melissa went still. Scott kept talking, maybe another 5 seconds. Then he saw her face. What? How much did you say? He paused. The investment. How much I thought you told me. No, your mother must have. She says she didn't. Scott reached for his water. Then maybe Wallace mentioned it. Why would her financial advisor tell you how much she invested? He didn't have an answer ready. For the first time, Melissa saw him searching for one. She stood. Sit down. Let me explain. She picked up her purse. That sounded less like a boyfriend. Then she walked out. 20 minutes after Daniel and I arrived, I saw her crossing the parking lot toward us. She got into the back seat. Daniel turned around. Are you okay? Please don't. 2 words. He faced forward again. I drove this time. We made it halfway home before Melissa started crying. Quietly, no dramatic sobbing. She just sat behind me wiping her cheeks and getting angrier every time another tear appeared. I wanted him to have an explanation, she said. I looked at her in the mirror. I know. No, you don't. Maybe not exactly. She stared out the window. I said, but I know what it's like to want someone you love to tell you the version you can live with. Daniel looked at me. I kept my eyes on the road. That sentence wasn't only about Melissa, he knew it. A few days later we got the answer about my drink. Nothing, no drug, no poison, nothing dangerous, just sangria. When Daniel told me, I said, "So you stole a perfectly good drink." It wasn't that good. You didn't even taste it. I smelled it. Of course you did. For about 10 seconds, the whole thing was funny. Then I asked the question that had been bothering me. Why give it to me? Daniel sat across from me at the kitchen table. To talk to you. He could have just talked to me. Handing somebody a drink gives you a reason to walk over. Then the conversation feels natural. I thought about Scott's questions. My job. Emily, Daniel's travel, when I got home. So he was gathering information. Possibly. Why me? Daniel hesitated. That hesitation was getting on my nerves. Say it. He may have thought you were the least suspicious person there. I stared at him. The harmless wife. I didn't say that. You took too long not saying it. Claire. No, listen. He did. You were right about Scott. Daniel opened his mouth. I held up my hand. That doesn't mean you were right about everything else. He closed it. I'm not asking you to tell me about investigations. I'm not asking for names or files or whatever else you legally can't discuss. I know. But if something affects me or Emily, you don't get to decide that ignorance is safer for us. His expression softened. Protecting me cannot mean keeping me ignorant. Daniel looked down at the table. Then he nodded. You're right. No defense, no qualification. Just that. It mattered more than I expected. 2 days later he came home while I was making dinner and set his phone beside the cutting board. The team found where some of the information came from. I stopped chopping onions. Scott. Before Scott got close to Melissa. I put down the knife. Then Melissa didn't give it to him. No, Evelyn. Daniel shook his head. I already knew I wasn't going to like the answer. Who? He looked at me. Rick. And suddenly I saw 3 moments all over again. Rick talking to Scott beside the house. Rick defending him on the phone. Rick asking about the office before anyone had told him which office the paperwork came from. They hadn't meant much separately. Together they meant something entirely different. Rick didn't deny talking to Scott. That would have been easier. Instead, he sat in his own living room the following Sunday, rubbed both hands over his face, and said, "It wasn't what you think." I looked at Melissa. She looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Rick. Evelyn said, "That sentence has never once been followed by good news." Nobody argued with her. We had agreed to meet at Rick's house because Daniel's colleagues had already spoken with him. Daniel had been very careful about that. He wasn't investigating his brother. He wasn't showing us evidence or pretending this was some family-run federal inquiry. What we were dealing with that afternoon was the part no agency could settle for us. Why Rick had kept quiet. His wife Linda was upstairs. She knew enough by then to understand that Rick had been hiding more than one thing. Rick stared at the floor. My company's been having problems. Daniel said nothing. How bad? Evelyn asked. Bad. That's not a number. Mom. You all seem very fond of vague answers lately. Rick sighed. 2 major commercial customers had paid months late. Material costs had gone up. He had lines of credit equipment loans, payroll insurance. At first he'd thought he could work his way through it. Then he borrowed more. Then he stopped telling Linda how bad things were. Melissa asked, "What does any of that have to do with Scott?" Rick looked at her. He knew people who arranged private financing. You asked my boyfriend for money? No, I asked about lenders. When last year? Melissa stared at him. That was before she and Scott had become serious. Daniel finally spoke. What information did you give him? Rick's head came up. I already went through this. With the agents, Daniel said. I'm asking you as your brother. I watched Daniel carefully. There was a difference in his voice. Not much of one, but enough. Rick heard it too. Company assets, property, some family background. What family background? I don't remember every conversation. Melissa gave a bitter laugh. I bet you remember now. Rick looked irritated. I wasn't giving him Mom's bank account. No, she said. Just telling him she had money. I didn't know what he was doing. That became Rick's shield. He said it again when Daniel asked about the lake property. Again when Evelyn asked whether he'd told Scott she lived alone. Again when Melissa asked why Scott knew so much about their family before she'd ever introduced him to everyone. I didn't know. Finally, I asked, when did you start wondering? Rick looked at me. What? You keep telling us you didn't know what he was doing. Fine, I believe you didn't know at first. He shifted in his chair. When did you start wondering? Nobody moved. Rick glanced at Daniel. I said, don't look at him. I'm asking. His mouth tightened. I thought Scott was getting too interested in Mom's finances. When? A few months ago. Melissa sat back. A few months. I didn't know it was criminal, but something bothered you. Yes. And you didn't say anything. Rick stood. What was I supposed to say? Hey everybody, the guy helping me find financing is asking questions I don't like. And by the way, my business is buried in debt, Evelyn answered before anyone else could. Yes. Rick turned toward her. Mom, Richard, that is exactly what you were supposed to say. His face reddened. You don't understand. I understand being embarrassed. This is more than embarrassment. I understand that too. You would have told Daniel. Probably. And then he would have started digging through my life. Daniel said, You mean I might have found out you were in trouble? Rick rounded on him. There, that. You always have to know everything. Daniel started to answer, then stopped. Because inconveniently, Rick had touched the same nerve Melissa had. It didn't excuse anything, but it wasn't entirely false. Melissa leaned forward. You knew enough to be worried about Scott. Rick looked at her. You knew enough to keep an eye on him. But when Daniel started questioning me, you said nothing. I didn't know what Daniel knew. You defended Scott. I was trying to keep everybody calm. No, you were trying to keep yourself out of it. Rick looked away. Melissa's voice dropped. You watched my own brother look at me like I'd opened the front door for a criminal. Melissa. And you let me think this was my fault. I didn't know. You knew enough. That ended the argument. Not because Rick agreed, because there wasn't much left to say. Evelyn had been quiet for nearly a minute. Then she asked, Did you know Scott was visiting me? Rick didn't answer quickly enough. Her face changed. Richard. I knew he'd stopped by once or twice. You knew. I didn't know why. You could have asked me. I should have. You could have told me your business was struggling. I had it handled. Evelyn looked around the room. At the risk of stating the obvious, you did not. Even Melissa almost smiled. Almost. Rick sat again. Evelyn studied him. I wouldn't have cared that you were having money trouble. Mom, I would have cared. I wouldn't have been ashamed of you. Rick looked down. But you watched someone get closer to me while you were worried about him because telling the truth might make you look foolish. Her voice never rose. That made it worse. I can forgive losing money, she said. I don't know yet what I'm going to do with that. Daniel started asking Rick about when Scott had first mentioned Evelyn. The tone changed immediately. Dates, conversations, locations. Agent Bennett had returned. I touched Daniel's arm. He looked at me. Your colleagues can investigate him. I'm just asking, I know. Rick watched us. I lowered my voice. Your mother needs her sons right now, not Special Agent Bennett. For a second, Daniel looked annoyed. Then he glanced at Evelyn. He sat back. Okay, that was new. The consequences came slowly after that, which is usually how consequences come in real life. Scott was arrested weeks later as part of the broader fraud investigation. Daniel wasn't the man putting handcuffs on him, and there was no dramatic family audience watching it happen. I was glad, By then I didn't need theater. Evelyn eventually recovered a substantial portion of her money after funds connected to the operation were frozen. Not all of it. That hurt. Rick wasn't charged as a knowing participant in the fraud, but his secrets didn't disappear because the government didn't prosecute him. Linda learned about the debts. They started counseling. Rick sold 2 pieces of equipment and cut his business down to something he could actually afford to operate. Melissa stopped asking for updates about Scott, at least from me. Then several weeks after the reunion, Evelyn called. "Come over. Is everything okay?" "Yes. What happened?" "Claire, if I explain it on the phone, there would be no reason for you to come over." Fair point. When I arrived, she had photographs spread across her kitchen table. Her cousin Diane had taken them at the reunion. Evelyn pushed one toward me. "Look." I saw myself near the drink table. Scott was handing me the glass. "What am I looking for?" "Not you." I looked again. Scott's face was turned slightly away from me. He was looking across the patio, at Daniel. In another photograph taken seconds later, Daniel was closer. Scott was already moving away. I stared at the 2 pictures side by side. Suddenly the sequence made sense. The questions, the drink, Scott disappearing the moment Daniel approached. That evening I showed Daniel the photographs. He studied them for a long time. "He recognized me," he said. I nodded. "He was testing you." Daniel looked at the first picture again. "Probably using me." His eyes came up. Months earlier he might have softened the wording. Told me we couldn't know for sure. Given me something technically accurate and emotionally useless. This time he didn't. "Yes," he said. And strangely enough, hearing the truth that plainly bothered me less than being protected from it ever had. Scott's arrest didn't fix the Bennett family. I think that surprised Daniel more than it surprised me. He'd spent most of his adult life working in a world where problems eventually became cases. Cases became evidence. Evidence became charges, or it didn't. There were procedures, deadlines, people whose job it was to decide what happened next. Families don't come with any of that. 3 months later, Scott was still moving through the federal court system, and I had stopped asking Daniel for updates. Most of what he could tell me was public anyway. Evelyn got a substantial portion of her money back, but not all of it. She hated that. Not because the loss threatened her house or retirement. It didn't. She hated knowing somebody had studied her closely enough to figure out what would work. Her answer was very Evelyn. She hired an independent fiduciary advisor. Not Daniel. When she told him we were sitting in our kitchen. "You interviewed him?" Daniel asked. Her Evelyn corrected. "You checked her credentials?" "Yes." "References?" "Yes." "Background?" Evelyn looked at me. "Does he do this in his sleep? Sometimes he questions the toaster." Daniel ignored us. "I'm serious, Mom." "So am I. I chose her because she's qualified and she has no emotional investment in controlling my life." Daniel looked offended. "I don't want to control your life." Evelyn and I both stared at him. He sighed. "Fine, I heard it." Later, after she left, he said, "I still think I should have access." That's called independence, Daniel. Your mother was right about one thing. One, don't ruin the moment. He smiled despite himself. Melissa had a harder time. She started seeing a therapist, though she told us almost nothing about it, which I thought was probably healthy considering her family's tendency to treat personal information like a group project. For a while she was embarrassed that she'd believed Scott. One afternoon she came over for coffee and said, "I keep replaying everything he said." Don't. Very useful advice. I have more. Don't date criminals. She gave me a look. Anything else, Floss? That finally got a laugh out of her. Then she became serious. How did I not see it? I knew what she wanted me to say. That Scott had been brilliant. That anyone would have fallen for him. That none of it had anything to do with choices she made. But Melissa didn't need another person protecting her from uncomfortable truths. You wanted him to be real, I said. She looked down at her coffee. That's pathetic. No, it feels pathetic. Believing somebody loves you isn't stupidity. She looked at me. Refusing to look after you know better is where the trouble starts. Melissa narrowed her eyes. You rehearsed that. Since Tuesday. She laughed again. Rick's life changed too. Linda stayed. That didn't mean she forgave him overnight. They went to counseling. Rick sold 2 pieces of equipment and reduced the size of his contracting business. He also told his adult sons how much debt he'd hidden. According to Evelyn, that conversation was biblical. I didn't ask for details. Melissa still wasn't ready to forgive him. Neither was Evelyn. That was another thing our family had to learn. Reconciliation and forgiveness aren't synonyms. You can sit at the same table before everything is settled. Sometimes sitting at the table is simply where you start. Daniel and I had our own work to do. He still couldn't tell me everything about his job. I stopped wanting him to. What I wanted was much simpler. One evening he came home late, loosened his tie, and found me sorting mail. "There's something going on at work that may affect my schedule this week," he said. I waited. "It isn't a danger to you or Emily. I can't give you more than that yet." I looked up. "What?" He frowned. "What, you just told me something?" "Yes, without making me drag it out of you." He rolled his eyes. "I'm capable of personal growth. Should I call somebody? Don't make me regret it. It was such a small thing. A year earlier he would have said, work thing. Might be late. Same confidentiality. Completely different marriage. A few weeks after that, Evelyn invited us to Sunday lunch. Only immediate family this time. No 30-person reunion, no name tags, no matching shirts that made grown adults look like employees at a garden center. Rick came early and helped set the table. Melissa brought an apple pie. Emily arrived with wine. Daniel took the bottle from her and studied the label. I said, "Please tell me the Bureau has finally cracked the Cabernet problem." He turned the bottle around. "Can't discuss an active investigation." "It has a screw cap," Emily said. "Criminals are getting sophisticated." Even Evelyn laughed. Nobody mentioned Scott during lunch. We didn't need to. He had occupied enough space in that family. When Daniel and I were getting ready to leave, Evelyn touched my arm. "Stay a minute." Daniel looked at me. "I'll be outside." That alone was progress. Evelyn waited until everyone else had gone. Then she began rearranging forks that were already perfectly arranged. "I owe you an apology." That was not a sentence Evelyn used casually. For a lot of years, actually. I stayed quiet. She looked at me. "I thought of you as Daniel's wife. I am Daniel's wife. You know what I mean?" I did. The Bennetts had never been cruel to me. That almost made it harder to explain. I was included, invited, welcomed. But there was always an invisible distinction between the Bennetts and the people who married them. Daniel handled serious things. Rick handled practical things. Melissa handled emotions whether she wanted to or not. And I brought potato salad. Evelyn said, "When everything happened, you were the only one in the room who wasn't trying to prove something." I had my moments. "Yes, well, you hid them better." I smiled. She reached for my hand. I was wrong about that. No tears, no grand speech, just Evelyn telling the truth. I squeezed her fingers. "Then don't treat me like a guest anymore." She nodded. Fair enough. On the drive home, I thought about that first afternoon. Scott walking toward me with 2 glasses. Daniel taking mine. "You didn't see who handed you that." For weeks I thought the whole story was about something I had failed to notice. It wasn't. All of us had missed something. Evelyn hadn't noticed when independence started turning into secrecy. Melissa hadn't noticed how badly she needed Scott to be exactly who he claimed to be. Rick did notice warning signs. His mistake was deciding not to look any closer. Daniel hadn't noticed that sometimes his version of protection felt exactly like exclusion to the people he loved. And me. I'd spent 19 years getting comfortable being the harmless wife, the one who didn't need all the details, the one who kept everybody calm, the one who brought the potato salad. I still bring it, by the way. I make excellent potato salad. I just ask more questions now. And no, I don't inspect every glass somebody hands me. Daniel does enough of that for both of us. But I pay a lot more attention to the people around the table. Because Scott didn't get into our family by being smarter than everybody. He got in because each of us had something we preferred not to look at. Sometimes the thing that protects you isn't knowing everything. It's being willing to notice what you'd rather ignore. If this story stayed with you, thank you for listening. Take good care of yourself and pay attention to who's around your table.